Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We've got a lot to cover, obviously, in this first hour because a lot of things have been happening in the news. I'm going to back up a little bit from the news just to look at some themes that are going to be very important for you to begin to understand as well. But we'll get into some of the news items as well. Second hour, we are going to be privileged to have with us Fernando Ortega. Now, of course, he is a composer, a musician, and a number of things that we will discuss have to do with music and worship and those kinds of topics, but he has a new book out on birds, of all things. He's an accomplished photographer. I've just been so impressed with that. And so we'll talk about creation and just a whole series of other topics. Steve Miller will be joining me on that topic as well. So that's something to look forward to. And again, just a reminder, as some of the books that we've published really remind you of, as terms of the fact that we, as Christians, really should appreciate art and appreciate the creation and begin to apply the kinds of talents that we might have. You might have artistic talents, you might have musical talents, you might have managerial skill talents. Certainly, many of you have parental talents of raising your kids, and so we want to certainly emphasize each aspect of that, and we'll be doing that in the second hour. First article I've posted here today by Charles Cook. Joe Biden is talking like a king. Now, the reason I bring it up is, first of all, Charles Cook is a great writer. Second of all, within the last week, we've seen now the president on two separate occasions say some things and be able to get away with some things that should concern us as various citizens. And as I've said on this program many times before, you don't lose your rights, you don't lose your liberty all at once. Sometimes it comes in incremental ways. And so Charles Cook, writing just the other day, said something really profound, and that is when the president was asked whether he possessed the authority to impose a national mask mandate on all of the states, President Joe Biden has simply said, well, I don't believe that I do thus far, but we're checking that. Now, if that sounds familiar, of course, it is exactly what we heard him say last week and talked about on this program when it came to the issue of the moratorium on evictions, in which he actually, in front of a camera, said, well, certainly the bulk of constitutional scholarship has said that this is not likely to pass constitutional muster, but we're going to do it anyway, and we will then see what happens as time goes on. And so the argument was, is we'll just keep this appeals process going for a month or least. And so we've been down this road before. As people like to say, you know, we've seen this movie, and here it is. Because remember back in 2012, then President Barack Obama repeatedly said that he lacked authorization to deal with what are oftentimes called the Dreamers, or DACA, which he eventually did implement. And it was interesting at the time because he said, look, I'm a president, I'm not a king, because hence the title here, Talking Like a King. And he had even said in 2010 that I can't do these things myself, but I've got to work with the executive branch and the legislative branch to make it happen. But shortly after doing that in 2012, he did it anyway. And so the argument that is being made here by Charles Cook, and I think it's a very accurate one, is we've sort of seen this movie, and it happens with some regularity. And that is, well, we just aren't so sure about this, so we are going to consider it to be an open question. It's kind of a gray area in the Constitution. First of all, it's not. But it, I think, illustrates this kind of idea that, well, we're just going to be checking on that. And on the third page, Charles Cook reminds us that what really the president is saying is when he says we're checking on that, I'm tasking my team of lawyers to determine whether there's some vague executive statement somewhere in some unrelated statute that could possibly be retooled in an emergency order, because this, after all, is an emergency that we're dealing with right now. And so whether it's the eviction moratorium, whether it's the ability to actually mandate masks in every school district in the country, and he can do this because, as he points out, Democrats can pretty much count on somebody, either in the academic world or the legal world or the media world, or maybe all three, to run cover for the president while he makes those statements. And so even so, you have the sense in which, as Charles Cook points out last week, Joe Biden was attacking the authority of both the Congress and the Supreme Court. This week he's taking aim at the federalist system that we have. And what we have noticed so far is many of the so-called watchdogs who were screaming pretty loud during the Trump administration seem to be remarkably silent. So as we're coming to a break, let me just give you a couple of points that he makes, because he says those who wish to kind of limit this presidential power really face three very significant problems. And you can write them down if you want. Problem number one is the U.S. Code. That is the federal code and the federal statutes. If you've ever seen how many pages that runs, there's always something there that could be in some way or another used or justified to allow for executive authority to vastly exceed what actually was allowed in the previous administration. So the sheer size of the Federal Register and the federal code is enough to make this a possibility. Number two, he also says the federal government has been able to really, by controlling the money, in a sense, actually achieve certain kinds of measures without even direct legislation. And he mentioned one that I'd forgotten about, and that is back in 1984, there was a desire to raise the drinking age to 21. Now, if you were around back then, and I was, the Congress ordered all states to actually do that, but they knew that there probably would be somewhere along the line a court that would rule that they don't have that ability to do so. So Congress simply said, if you don't actually raise the drinking age to 21, you will receive zero federal funds. And everybody fell in line. I can think of another one, since I'm the old guy around the table. Back in the 1970s, same thing with a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit that then President Jimmy Carter wanted to do. Again, if you don't have a 55, it's hard to believe we used to have a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, but nevertheless, you will not receive federal highway funds if you do so. And then, of course, the third one he mentions, which I've already alluded to, is that the press will cover for a Democrat like Joe Biden, and the press will lose its mind if it's a Republican, especially if it was Donald Trump. And so, nevertheless, this first article is very well written. Charles Cook is such a good writer, but he's reminding us that just in the last week, there have been a number of times where the president, Joe Biden, is acting like a king. And the reason he uses that phrase king was that's what was said by one of the predecessors, President Barack Obama. I'm not a king. I'm just the president. I have to work with the legislative branch. I have to work with the executive branch. And then turned right around and passed it. Not only DACA, but DAPA, but I won't get into all those details because we're coming to a break. But if you want to see how we lose our power, we lose it a little bit every single day when these kinds of statements are made and nobody challenges them. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
When the Supreme Court reconvenes, the justices will consider another case involving the Second Amendment. As you might expect, legal briefs are being filed and various groups advocating for gun rights and gun control are promoting their views. Therefore, it should not be too surprising that someone is trying to argue that the Second Amendment is racist. What is surprising is the fact that this proponent is associated with the ACLU. I may have many disagreements with the policy positions of the ACLU, but I would expect the members would at least understand basic U.S. history. As Charles Cook explains in a recent commentary, it is not gun rights that have been historically associated with racism, but gun control. And to the extent that up until 1970, the two ideas were utterly inextricable in American life. But don't take his word for it. Just look at a few of the legal briefs that have been filed with the court in this case. For example, a brief filed by the National African American Gun Association reminds the court of U.S. history. They said that during the colonial, founding, and early republic periods, slaves and even free blacks, particularly in the southern states, were either barred from carrying a firearm at all or required to obtain a license to do so, which was subject to the discretion of a government official. Charles Cook also quotes another legal brief which was filed by a progressive group that probably isn't much of a supporter of the Second Amendment, but nevertheless was alarmed by the real-life consequences of this case the Supreme Court is considering. You know, some people may not like the concept of gun rights, but calling the Second Amendment racist is historical revisionism and propaganda. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, want to look at some broad issues, and then we'll get into some specific ones. Every once in a while, it's worth just kind of pulling back a little bit, getting a 2,000-foot look at what is happening in our culture. And just a minute ago, I wanted to talk about, as you heard, the possibility that almost every single statement being made over the last week by the president or by his administration to justify it allows for the possibility of further expansion of the executive power. And so we should pay attention to that. Another aspect of that, which we've talked about on this program many times before, is he who can define the terms oftentimes wins the debate. And you can see this. For example, you want to win the argument on abortion. Well, we'll call it choice, pro-choice. Well, who's against choice? I mean, obviously, we can point out all the fallacies of that idea of choice, but nevertheless, pro-choice sounds pretty good. And almost every bill that's been passed usually has a good, nice sounding phrase to it. And you can think of all sorts of other kinds of ways in which terms have been positively presented, and as a result, people maybe unthinkingly accept that. Another one that you certainly can talk about is marriage equality. I mean, I want to redefine the whole definition of marriage for centuries and even millennia, but when I use the word marriage equality, well, of course, I believe in equality, and so you can see sometimes just changing the definition or adding a word to that definition can help you really begin to win the public policy debate. A related aspect of that is what is in the second article today by Star Parker. Star Parker's been on the program before. African-American individual that grew up on welfare and is really one of the all-time success stories, ran for Congress, and nevertheless is a columnist. And she says the enabling tool of what we call the cancel culture or wokeness is language. And she's really been thinking about this in terms of racial categories, but let's just let her kind of speak to it for just a minute. Her second sentence is, people are put into categories to which names are assigned, and this supposedly captures who they are and what should be done with them politically. And she points out in particular, the left puts people in racial categories as instruments towards their political agenda. And so she digs back into history a little bit and reminds us back in 1977, the Federal Interagency Committee on Education actually produced at that time a 5-race classification: American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian or Pacific Islander, Black, White, and Hispanic. And so you basically had Indians, Asians, Black, White, Hispanic. That's the categories that you had. She then points out these categories over time continued to undergo changes and refinements. For example, she says the Hispanic category emerged in the 1970s, and the legislation describing this group as Americans who identify themselves as being of Spanish-speaking background and trace their origin or descent from Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Central and South America, or other Spanish-speaking countries. So an American with roots in Spain, an American with roots in Peru ended up in the same category because their country of origin was Spanish-speaking. Now, she points out that Hispanic is neither race nor ethnicity. It's a category of political design, including individuals from about 20-plus countries with no commonality other than a language their grandparents spoke. And so by the time you fast forward to the latest census, I did not add those up, so I'll trust her for this. In the latest census, you had 19 different possibilities for self-categorization. You might remember when we've talked about this issue of race, I've pointed out that now we have so many boxes, and because of interracial marriage, you have people that could check more than one box. Matter of fact, multiple boxes. I've used Tiger Woods as an example. Kamala Harris fits as that examples, and all of the rest. And then she points out in both the white and black categories, filers are now asked to respond to additional questions regarding their country of origin. And the point she is making here is that if you wanted to get a good definition of racism, that's it. Because now we're actually defining people in terms of their race. Once they're in that category, it's almost seen as immutable, which at a time when the, if you will, the races are blending in ways that you probably would have expected anyway, that's exactly the case. And so she then goes on to use an illustration that will be really relevant when we have Fernando Ortega with us next hour. It has to do, of all things, with birds. I thought it was kind of interesting. She was talking about a video that she saw with the individual that won the Nobel Prize in Physics, Richard Feynman. Anyway, Richard Feynman actually has a video that starts with the headline, "Names Don't Constitute Knowledge." Feynman recalls walking through a park with his father, and his father telling him the names of the different birds in different languages. But in the end, the professor said, you know what different people call the bird around the world, but you don't know anything about the bird, which I thought was interesting because the point he was making is names don't constitute knowledge. And that is the case. I'm not going to claim next hour when we have Fernando Ortega, when we talk about some of the birds in his bird book, that I have any kind of unbelievable ability to name every one of those, but I've been kind of an amateur birder for some time, and it has been interesting when we go for walks with my wife, my kids, and others. I'm pretty good at saying, okay, well, mockingbird, cardinal, nighthawk, whatever, and as soon as they know what the name of the bird is, cedar waxwing, whatever it is, they sort of feel like they know something. I'm thinking, you don't know anything about that bird other than the name. And there is a sense in which she uses this great illustration to say that just by saying you're Hispanic or just by saying you're Black or African American, that really doesn't tell you much of anything. But in some respects, her argument is that once you've put people in that particular category and then you stray from it, Well, that gets to be the cancel culture. And, of course, she probably more than other individuals, as the president of the Center for Urban Renewal and Education, probably has had that used against her more and more. You're a black woman, you should be a Democrat. What in the world are you saying this for? You're a black woman, you should believe in more and more welfare benefits. You actually used to live on welfare, and yet you're instead encouraging entrepreneurship. You're encouraging people to stand their own 2 feet. It's kind of interesting to see that in this very good article, again, written by Star Parker, how many people find themselves labeled. And as she points out, one of the tools which allow for wokeness and the cancel culture is language, which is one of the reasons why we so often here at Point of View do talk about language and definitions and the rest, because those are really key indeed. Let's take a break. When we come back, I want to maybe update you on a couple of the stories we've been following. We're about ready to get the intelligence community report on where did COVID-19 come from. Now, lest you think, oh, well, they're certainly now going to come to the conclusion that this was due to a lab leak at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, I will read to you some of the things from CNN that make us wonder whether or not there will be any kind of definitive conclusion in that regard. And you probably have been following, because we've talked about this a few times, about some of these Democrats in the state of Texas that decided that they did not want to actually participate in some of the votes that were going to be taking place on everything from election reform to redistricting. So 57 of these House Democrats in the Texas House flew to Washington, D.C. on private jets, spent time with the vice president, and actually have only occasionally returned. Not only a few of them have returned. And so as a result, what you have is the decision by the governor of the state of Texas to say, well, we're going to issue a warrant for their arrest. Well, just as soon as that was put forward, then you have one judge putting a stay on that particular issue. And lest you say, well, that's only a Texas issue, I'll remind you that we have seen this happening more and more in various states. And what happens in Texas, I think, is going to be really instructive as to whether or not we're going to see more of this, as we saw a number of times in places like Wisconsin, saw it in Oregon a while back, and other places, or whether or not there were going to be punishments for individuals who say, I'm going to lose the vote, so I'm going to just simply leave so that there's not a quorum and they can't vote on that particular issue. And that also gives us a little bit of history I want to get into. Why is it that if indeed Republicans or Democrats wanted to leave the Senate or the House, that makes no difference. But when individuals leave from these various legislatures, Wisconsin, Oregon, Texas, it actually disrupts everything. And so there's a little bit of history behind that, which we'll talk about as well. As we go to a break, let me just mention my commentary today, which we may not get to today, but certainly is posted. Gun rights and racism. There is a case before the Supreme Court having to do with gun rights. And as hard as it is to believe, some people are saying, oh, the Second Amendment, well, that was done for racist reasons. Well, you knew you were going to hear that. Is there an answer to it? Yes, there's some very good answers, and you'll see that on our website at pointofview.net. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Let me, if I can, real quickly address this issue of the Intelligence Committee report that will be coming down on the origin of COVID-19. And I don't think you have to even look at that report or even spend much time thinking about whether or not this was intentional or accidental, or whether it came from a wet market or whether it came from the Institute. I think at least everybody can agree that the communist Chinese government did all it can to prevent the rest of the world from taking important and very significant reactions, which have kept it from killing so many people around the world. So if we even start with something that we can all agree on and then suggest the possibility that they were engaged in experiments that shouldn't have been done, and whether it was done intentionally or accidentally, there is just a tremendous amount of anger right now. A very good piece that came out by Kyle Smith, in which he was quoting one that I was reading the other day. Almost put it on the web page here. It is from Rolling Stone magazine. Yeah, every once in a while we do post a Rolling Stone magazine article. The thing that kept me from posting it was just the number of swear words in it, and I didn't want to have our person that would put it up there, Karen, have to take all of those out. I mean, the inability of some individuals to just communicate basic facts without swearing and using words that obviously we would not use on the program and we wouldn't want you to be reading. But there are so many people that are right now angry at people that aren't wearing masks or are wearing masks. They are vaccinated, they aren't vaccinated. And yet there seems to be almost no anger at the legitimate source, and that is China, the communist Chinese government. And right now, if we were to actually look at what is coming down, the intelligence community, which are full of very bright people, are just having difficulty coming to a conclusion. But don't take my word for it. I'm going to read this from CNN. Tell me what you think. Intelligence officials are nearing the end of a 90-day investigation into the origins of COVID-19 that was ordered by President Joe Biden, and have drafted a classified report that is now in the preliminary review process, according to three sources familiar with the probe. Sources familiar with the initial report say that after 3 months of poring over data and raw intelligence, the intelligence community is still divided over two theories. One suggesting the virus originated from a lab in Wuhan, China, and the other suggesting it jumped naturally to humans from animals. The sources said the report, as it stands right now, carries and contains nothing too earth-shattering. Really? And so they're digging through what they say a treasure trove of genetic data, trying to uncover the origins of the coronavirus. Some of this requires looking at what they call genetic blueprints and looking at virus samples. And then there seems to be maybe a little bit of, well, this is a manpower issue because we have to get all sorts of scientists to look at this and try to interpret complex genetic sequencing data, which is all true. But others that have looked at it have already pointed out that the genetic features, the genome, if you will, of this virus, which is now mutated, looks nothing like what you would find in nature. And so there are many people that are wondering that when this report actually comes out, it will say nothing. And so our friend Jim Garrity at National Review put it this way. Here's how the questions will go. How did the pandemic start? Well, we don't know. Is it safe to perform gain-of-function research on contagious viruses in the middle of a Chinese transportation and trade hub? We don't know. Are wet markets ticking time bombs that offer the perfect environment for new viruses to jump from animals to people and too dangerous to allow to continue operating? We don't know. When did the Chinese government realize that it had a pandemic on its hands? We don't know. How do we prevent the next pandemic? We don't know. Which is, I think, the sad commentary on the just inability right now for individuals to acknowledge the obvious, and that is China is our enemy. And if you say that, you're going to be criticized roundly, and yet the evidence is pretty clear. And this brings us to our third article we've posted here. This one comes from Ben Johnson. He's actually reporting what happened in a Senate Intelligence Committee meeting yesterday. And that is the title of this: The Media Ignore the Biggest the biggest illegal wealth transfer in the history of mankind. And let me just quote a little bit from Senator Marco Rubio from Florida. He said, China is stealing between $300 billion and $600 billion a year of American technology and intellectual property. He goes on to say they use venture capital funds to buy promising technology startups. They hide their ownership, by the way. They partner with universities on research, then they steal that research, often research whose seed funding came from the U.S. taxpayers. They force American companies doing business in China to give the technology over them. And then a little bit later, Marco Rubio says they have weaponized our openness, they have weaponized our decency, they have weaponized a corporate lust for profits against us. China is already carrying out the biggest illegal wealth transfer from one nation to another in the history of mankind. That's reason enough to be concerned, but let me hold up our booklet on privacy and surveillance, because a little bit later this article reminds us that Americans' privacy and cybersecurity have also been victimized by the Chinese Communist Party's increasing technological hegemony. It is estimated, according to some researchers, that 80% of American adults, which means most of you in the listening audience, have had all of their personal data stolen by the Chinese Communist Party, and the other 20%, most of their personal data. And so you would think that the press would really want to cover this. And this article is all about how so many of these news outreaches and news outlets really didn't do much coverage, except for the ones that you would imagine, like C-SPAN, of course, is going to be covering it, and maybe Roll Call on the Hill. But also there are individuals that have been very critical of some of the things that were said. One example would be the news with Rick Sanchez. Sanchez talked about the fact that, let's be serious, China doesn't pose any threat or challenge to the West, which, again, what world is he living in? Here's his direct quote: "Clearly, in the eyes of the men and women of the U.S. Senate, most of whom are older than dirt and see the world through the prism of Cold War, China needs to be defeated because it's a threat." And he even says that Rubio's opening speech sounds like we're in the 1950s. It felt like I was listening to Joe McCarthy. That speech is about Russia, about Vietnam, about Korea. No, it's about China right now, and the very significant threat that we indeed do face with that country. So while people are walking around getting upset at their fellow Americans because they do or they don't wear masks, they were or they were not vaccinated, and all of that, I do believe that if you really wanted to let your anger go in a direction, it certainly seems like we should talk about the Chinese Communist Party that allowed so much of this to happen and is stealing our technology and hardly even getting a mention in the media. But just before we take a break, let me just mention that one of the things that's been happening in the state of Texas, but it can certainly be happening in a legislature next to you as well, are the fact that sometimes what we see is, if, in this case, mostly Democrats, well, there is one Republican example that I've mentioned before, but in most cases it's been Democrats, when they realize they don't have the upper hand in the legislature, they leave town. This has happened in the Texas House before, it's happened in the Texas Senate, and it happened the other day when 57 Texas House Democrats took off. And a lot of that has to do with the way the word quorum is defined. If you look at the Constitution, all we need is a majority of those present, basically. So a quorum is really simple. If you had even 51 people in the Senate, that's enough. They don't have to be all of 100 or anything like that. But given the fact that later, when these various state constitutions were written, Texas a good example, you have to have 2/3 of the members. And that was done, I think, in part to prevent individuals from maybe just getting a group of individuals to vote on something. They would require a quorum, but I don't think it occurred to people that the biggest problem we would have in many of these state constitutions is that since it requires 2/3 of all the members, not just 2/3
2/3 of those who are present to make a quorum, then you end up with a situation which the minority party, in most cases it's been in Wisconsin and Texas, where the one time it was a Republican, was in Salem, Oregon, just simply leave town. And something needs to change. And we've been watching this for some time. And so the governor said, I know, we can arrest them. But as you might imagine, another judge stepped in and said, nope, can't do that. And you can't compel them to go to actually do the people's business. And so we've got to find some way to resolve this. And I'm hoping that somewhere along the line it is possible to arrest those individuals or to actually have a special election to defeat them and put someone else in office. Or what's been happening occasionally will happen on a routine basis. And that's not good for a democracy. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then next hour we're going to get out of all of this. Aren't you ready to get out of some of this news and information, some of the sad things that are being said right now, and maybe just enjoy God's creation and learn from Fernando Ortega, first of all, in terms of his creative emphasis in terms of music, but I was completely unaware of his creativity in terms of photography. This is one of those times where we really wish we did have a TV show where we could show the pictures, but we'll hold them up occasionally for those of you watching online. But what I want to end with are two principles that you might want to use in terms of having discernment. This is a theme we've been talking about for some time. And so I'm going to go to our
article, first of all. It has to do with this issue of climate change. Of course, we have our climate change booklet, if you'd like. But this particular piece, written by William Briggs, has been on the program. He's been on with us when we've talked about the book that came out that he and Jay Richards and others wrote on the price of panic, how the tyranny of experts turned a pandemic into a catastrophe. He's also been on with us because he's one of those individuals who is actually doing some of the statistical analysis of the 2020 election. As a matter of fact, is cited in a number of legal cases raising questions from some of the different states, which we've talked about before. But this time, he uses his kind of statistical analysis and his mathematical expertise to look at the climate change report that's come out from the IPCC. And he says, first of all, how many times can you be wrong about a matter of great importance and still be taken seriously and not fired? Says, trick question. The answer is you can never be fired for being wrong in the right direction. And the point he's making is that you have the latest international statement from this group, the IPCC Climate Assessment Report. And again, we've talked about this earlier in the week. We may even come back to it tomorrow on our weekend edition with Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford, in which, again, there's sort of this doom and gloom. To be fair, as I pointed out just the other day, if you read the IPCC, I wouldn't read all of it, but even if you read the summary, it's about 41 pages, and even that you could scan it, you'd see that some of the news headlines are much more extreme than even what's being said there. But William Briggs, before we get to the principle that you can use to evaluate news stories and other things, does remind us of how the consensus has changed dramatically. He says because originally there was a global cooling consensus back in the 1970s, and I'm old enough to remember that, which later turned into a consensus of global warming in the late 1980s. But during much of the 1970s, there was a concern, and if you have any doubts about that, you can type in global cooling 1970s, global cooling Time magazine. You can see some of the cover stories and all the rest, because the argument being made at the time, and I was in first undergraduate in graduate school during that time, was that because of pollution, man-made pollution, we were going to be blocking out the sun rays, and there would be a concern about a new ice age. Now, by the time I got to Yale, we started noticing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere going up, and so certainly by the 1980s, there were some that were starting to think, well, maybe we actually will have global warming. I remember one of my professors even said, well, maybe the two will counteract each other, and it won't get too hot, it won't get too warm. That, is seemingly almost what happened, but nevertheless. And so then, of course, William Briggs reminds us that the atmosphere is going to change, sometimes because of human activity. But again, as he said, when the temperatures began to warm in a few places in the 1980s, then the theory really changed. And so now burning fossil fuels was going to trap the effects of the sun rays, causing a so-called greenhouse effect. Well, now back to the principle that you can use, because he reminds us in the third page that mountains of research are done to prove that everything we loved were going to be destroyed and everything we hated was going to increase. And he says, my friends, this cannot be. It's impossible that atmospheric change can bring about only harm and cause no good. And there's the principle. When you hear people giving you predictions for the future, and there's never any nuance, this is all going to be bad, it's never going to be good. Think about this. You know as well as I do that the increase in temperature probably is a good thing for certain plants. Increase in carbon dioxide is a good thing for plants. Any of you that have access to a greenhouse, I even know in our own neighborhood, we have a few people that have a greenhouse. By having the actual greenhouse effect that keeps it warm for the plants, they grow a lot better. Some people even artificially pump in carbon dioxide. So when all of it is bad, and none of it is ever good, you have to maybe be a little more skeptical. So the principle is, if you're going to have discernment, if somebody is telling you what's going to happen in the future and it's all negative and there's not any positive to it whatsoever, that's reason enough to be skeptical.
Here's a second principle. When you see the first column or the first article, it's probably good to wait till the second or third comes out. And I wanted to do this for all our baseball friends, because if you picked up the New York Times the other day, the Colorado Rockies investigating whether a fan shouted a racial slur at a Marlins baseball player. I just had to end with this. Of course, some people are looking through the glass smiling at me because they know where I'm taking this. But interestingly enough, the people began to do some additional research. And again, let's give credit at least to the Associated Press, because here the argument was one of the Miami Marlins players was being targeted by a fan at Coors Field because supposedly he was shouting a racial slur. The Colorado Rockies investigated and said, no, actually, the individual, the fan at Coors Field, was actually saying the name of the mascot. And the mascot, I'll hold it up here, is Dinger. Now, again, for those of you that don't know baseball, when a guy hits a home run, what do we call it? A dinger, and this is Dinger. Now, I will admit, maybe that could be, maybe if you're not hearing it real carefully, could think it sounds like something else. But that, I think, is a good illustration of the fact that what we were starting to see here is now we still don't, even with the Associated Press, get the fan off of the bad seat, because they say the fan is suspected of not actually using a racial slur. So we just couldn't bring ourselves to say, oops, big foul, we made a mistake. We didn't know that he was using the name of the mascot Dinger, but it illustrates, I think, another principle. When you see that somebody is being labeled as a racist or somebody was using a racial slur, are there people that use it? Sure. Are a lot of those misinterpreted? Yes, they are. And here is a perfect example that 24 hours later, most people are actually now acknowledging that it was completely overreaction to yelling at the mascot, not at the Marlins player. But again, because the player's African American, he assumed that's what it was. And of course, it illustrates once again another principle. Number one, when you hear somebody tell you that it's all going to be bad, you probably need a little more nuance in that regard. And I really think William Briggs gives us a good illustration of that in terms of the IPCC pronouncements. But number two, just because it shows up quickly in Twitter, or it even shows up, and I've got Associated Press, say I've got USA Today, I've got New York Times, I think there was one in the Washington Post, doesn't necessarily mean it's true. Fortunately, they did not put the name of that fan. Can you imagine what his life would have been like if they actually mentioned his name? And we know what happens there in our cancel culture. So, a couple principles to pass on to you to make sure that you have the kind of discernment that you need to have. Next hour, though, we're going to have some great conversation, I think, with Fernando Ortega. Stay tuned. We'll be back with him right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to be talking with Fernando Ortega. Also joining me in studio is Steve Miller, who is the producer of Point of View. And certainly we've appreciated his music. We've crossed paths with Fernando Ortega. I think last time I did was at a Moody Broadcasting event, and that's years ago. But then, Steve, the other day you also showed me the book by Fernando Ortega on birds. Now, I am a photographer, nothing like this. Although if you look on one of my walls, I do have at least one picture of a red-shouldered hawk and a few others. But this is amazing, and it just illustrates, again, we'll talk about just in a few minutes, the incredibly talented individual that he is. I've always had just high regard for Fernando Ortega. After seeing this book, it's gone up a couple more notches.
Yes,
but
right.
Let's do the honors here. Of course, if you are not familiar, Fernando Ortega, composer, pianist, classically trained, musically complex, as many people have said, one of the more respected artists in the Christian world, with 3 Gospel Music Dove Awards. You perhaps know some of his music, This Good Day, Jesus, King of Angels, Sleepless Nights, taking some of the old hymns like Be Thou My Vision and producing that. He has a number of different CDs and albums out there. And Fernando Ortega, it's just been great to have you on the program, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be on your show.
I might just mention, Steve, we'll probably get to the bird book a little bit later, and it is pretty amazing as well. But I thought we might just start off by talking about some of the background with Fernando Ortega.
Yeah, Fernando, thanks again for joining us. And I want to say probably one of the first albums. I just said album, didn't I?
Well, that's fine. I like that word.
Yeah, I still have a stack of them at home.
Yes, we do.
I listened to This Bright Hour, and I remember my wife and I were driving where else but to Angel Fire. And
wow.
Yeah, and that was the first time I really had experience with your music, exposure to your music. And that first track, Angel Fire, has this haunting beauty to it. And it's this acute awareness of the world around us and creation. And as I look at your music, and I think people would agree, it just has such an influence. It's influenced so much by the place where you grew up, I think, as well as your family heritage. Could you speak to that a little bit and tell us how that has shaped you as a musician?
Well, I come from, on both sides of my family, my mom's and my dad's, a long line of storytellers. And as kids, really, we would just sit we went to both houses. I never knew my grandfather on my mom's side, but my grandma and her brothers, we would just sit and listen to them to reminisce about the old days and about days even before they were born and back several generations. And then on my grandfather's side, he was definitely like the ultimate storyteller. And the oral tradition in that village where he lived, Chimayo, New Mexico, is still alive. But he was really one of the people who carried it on, who told the old stories from the 1700s of the earliest Ortegas. To be honest, I think my family goes further back than even that, because my daughter and I have been researching our family tree, and I discovered the first Ortega that I'm descended from, who lived in Albuquerque, was born in 1614, just a few miles from where I'm sitting right now.
Wow.
And then he died in Mexico, but his family stayed on in New Mexico, and they moved up north to that area that you're referring to, where Angel Fire is. So I have a lot of generations in this state.
It's a beautiful, beautiful part of the country, and I don't know how many of us can trace our heritage back that far.
17th century.
I was visiting with some family a couple of months ago in West Virginia, and we were tracing some heritage back, but not that far. I mean, we're talking about to the time of Shakespeare. That is
amazing.
It's really amazing.
Yeah, I was thrilled. I was emotional when I researched that stuff. Things would pop up, and it was really, really something.
Wow, I think that's important too, and that's some. When I think of that, I also think of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, where over and over there's this encouragement to remember and to call to mind things, and I think that's so important as an artist. I would say I would agree that has tremendous value.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to evade your question about how that has influenced me, but I think that my roots are so deep in New Mexico, and I lived in California for 23 years, and I think even when I first started out there was the ocean, and it was exciting. I was in my 20s, but the longing to be back here, to the shape and the contours of New Mexico, and the culture and my heritage and my family. It was constantly calling me back, and I, when I moved back, it was definitely I was ready to be here. So, and that has shaped my music. You can hear references to just the big open spaces and the different places throughout my songs.
Yeah, in fact, one of my favorite lyrics of yours in Road Song is this brief phrasing that says, "A sky so wide you can feel your heart turn quiet." And I love that. I mean, and if you've been, and New Mexico certainly isn't the only place, but around the world, you go to places that capture you in that way. And I think you've done a tremendous job of conveying that imagery. It was just beautiful.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, the big New Mexico sky was a decent replacement for the massive Pacific Ocean that I loved going down to all the time. We lived 4 blocks from the ocean, so I would just sit there and stare, but yeah, everything has got its beauty.
What about some of the other influences? Even in your bio here, it talks about Celtic, bluegrass, classical, Latin. When you came on the Christian music scene, you were kind of different than the rest of some of the musicians, weren't you?
Well, I guess so. I think what launched my career was my interest in hymns, and that was sort of forced by the church that I attended in California. They were an evangelical church, but they suddenly began to take on this very seeker-driven, I don't know what the word is, platform or seeker-driven philosophy. And so the services started to become like shows. It was like a variety show. There was acting, there was dancing, and then there was music, but the music they wanted me to do more, James Taylor, Eagles, songs like that. And I would sit in the backstage area and just think, oh my gosh, I really miss the stuff I sang when I was a kid,
Yes.
So I started arranging hymns, and I started inserting those into the format of the service, which ultimately got me, to be blunt, fired from that place because they wanted to go in a much different direction. So hymns are what launched me. And I was just talking to a friend of mine the other day from Alison Krauss's band.
Oh, yeah.
And Ron Block is his name. He's a banjo player, one of the greatest banjo players on the planet. But he found my hymns record, and then he sought me out. And
wow.
And we became friends, and through them I became friends with Nickel Creek, which is Sean and Sarah Watkins and Chris Thiele. And that music, that bluegrass music, really, I was just so impressed by it, how virtuosic these guys were. Anyway, that's where that comes from.
We're going to take a break, and we will continue our conversation with Fernando Ortega. Steve Miller in studio with me, and we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
When
When the Supreme Court reconvenes, the justices will consider another case involving the Second Amendment. As you might expect, legal briefs are being filed and various groups advocating for gun rights and gun control are promoting their views. Therefore, it should not be too surprising that someone is trying to argue that the Second Amendment is racist. What is surprising is the fact that this proponent is associated with the ACLU. I may have many disagreements with the policy positions of the ACLU, but I would expect the members would at least understand basic U.S. history. As Charles Cook explains in a recent commentary, it is not gun rights that have been historically associated with racism, but gun control. And to the extent that up until 1970, the two ideas were utterly inextricable in American life. But don't take his word for it. Just look at a few of the legal briefs that have been filed with the court in this case. For example, a brief filed by the National African American Gun Association reminds the court of U.S. history. They said that during the colonial, founding, and early republic periods, slaves and even free blacks, particularly in the southern states, were either barred from carrying a firearm at all or required to obtain a license to do so, which was subject to the discretion of a government official. Charles Cook also quotes another legal brief, which was filed by a progressive group that probably isn't much of a supporter of the Second Amendment, but nevertheless was alarmed by the real-life consequences of this case the Supreme Court is considering. You know, some people may not like the concept of gun rights, but calling the Second Amendment racist is historical revisionism and propaganda. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Fernando Ortega with us by phone, and in studio with us, Steve Miller. Let me just mention that we do have a link to FernandoOrtega.com. We will be in just a little bit probably talking about his book, which is just putting together a flair for his storytelling and really great nature photography. As a matter of fact, that's one of the endorsements that comes from an ornithologist at Harvard University, and it brought me back to my bird class at Yale University in the graduate school. But let's, if we can, get back to the hymns, because that's something that in many cases we know Fernando Ortega for, don't we?
Yeah, and I guess where we left off, Fernando, you had just been fired, right?
Yeah.
For singing hymns and playing hymns, yes.
Yeah, I mean, the pastor was a swell fellow, and we're still friends after all these years.
Yeah.
But he was under such pressure from the elder board to change, you know, how they identified our church, how the public viewed our church. So he said, you know, he said, I'm sorry, but we have to let you go. And so, and from there I went to work for Chuck Swindoll for a year, which was one of my, I worked for him for a year, and then he moved to Dallas Theological Seminary and became, you know, what was he, the president of
right.
He was
president for a while. That's right. And now the chancellor. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
Yeah. The hymns you've covered, though, I love the fact that you're digging deep because you cover, for instance, "Stricken, Smitten, and Afflicted," and "My Song Is Love Unknown," and I love those. It's not the sort of hymn you hear every day, and these are songs of such deep theological importance and just really so visceral. And are these the sorts of hymns? Did you explore hymns as you got older? Or are these the sorts of hymns that you sang when you were young, or how did that work for you?
Well, the two you mentioned, the first one's the Scottish hymn, and the second one is a Welsh hymn. Mm-hmm. I discovered after I left that Swindoll's church when he moved away. I joined a Reformed church, and that stricken, spin, and afflicted almost was like an anthem. It was this church full of surfers, and our parking lot was little pickup trucks with surfboards in the back, and as soon as service was out, they'd head to the beach. But they were really smart kids, and every time that hymn would come up in the mix on Sunday, they would stand up and sing, and tears coming out of their eyes. Mm-hmm. It was just such a powerful thing. So that helped me, and that was not a hymn I had heard as a kid. So it helped me start collecting hymnals when I would go to antique stores and old bookstores. And look for hymns that I had never heard, that had been just gone away with time, lost their place in the canon.
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing that we can keep discovering the richness of these things, and I think it's fantastic that you've done that. I came across a quote, shifting gears a bit to some of the other types of music you've done. I came across a quote, I don't even know where it was, but it was on the interwebs, so it has to be right, I guess. But about 2006, it says, "My records have always been about how the Gospels find expression in a person's everyday life, the sorrowful, the mundane, and the joyful." And I love the idea, and if you could talk about just a little bit, the importance of making these things, these sorrow and the mundane things and the joyful things, all an integral part of our lives, and how that has influenced your music and why you think that's important.
I think the first time that idea hit me was I was singing for a youth camp in Pennsylvania, and I was staying at the pastor's home. The pastor eventually became a mentor, and one of my best friends in the world, and he passed away last year. But they had a huge house. They had it was 4 stories. It was a manse. It was a Civil War era house, and there was an Amish family who cleaned the house for them every Friday. And I heard this beautiful singing coming as I was coming down the stairs, coming from the kitchen, and one of the Amish girls, I think she was in her early 20s, was washing dishes, this pile of dishes from that big family, and just singing this hymn, and I kind of startled her, and I said, "What is that music?" And she turned around and she says, "It's called People of the Living God." And tears were coming out of her eyes, and I thought, this woman is doing something so mundane, but finding God in that moment and singing to Him and praising Him. And I thought, wow, that just stuck with me, for a long time. Yeah. Still does when I tell the story.
I think it's so important because most of our lives are taken up, right, with doing the mundane things. Yeah. Not only that, I mean, they are also taken up with sorrow. I mean, we do not weep as those who have no hope, the Scripture says, but we do weep. And when you've got a song, Angel Fire, Now That You're Gone, Anita's song, I think of these songs as being songs that don't necessarily tie things up in a nice package. They deal with sorrow, but they deal with it bluntly, and dealing with loss and pain, I think, seems to be an integral part also of your music.
Yeah, and those songs that you brought up, those are hard songs about death, and one about a daughter who's just gone astray, really, and that particular situation, really far astray. And eventually, in the end, she came back around and she became a Christian.
Oh, fantastic.
But there were years of grief for that mom, longing for her kid to come back. And so I think that, sometimes I'll sing those songs and somebody will say, "Why do you sing such a hopeless song?" But I never sing them just by themselves. One in a single song, you can't, state the whole human condition and the redemption of man, and those things just don't happen in a single song. But on my records, I try to create the whole picture.
Yeah. I think about a quote, and Kerby's heard me give this before, but T-Bone Burnett has this quote. He says, "If Jesus is the light of the world, there are two two kinds of songs you can write. You can write songs about the light, or you can write songs about what you see from the light. And that's what I do.
Oh, that's a good quote. Wow.
And it's always struck me. I was reading a book by Steve Turner called Imagine, and he quoted Burnett. And I think about that because what you write about, some might say, well, that's not the gospel, but it's about what you see by the light of the gospel, isn't it?
Yes.
That's right. Hopefully the things that you see, if you're a Christian, the way you see them, hopefully that, expresses itself in the words you write. And so, that's been something that's interested me for a long time.
Well, just decide. Kind of I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I just said writing those kind of songs.
Yeah. Anita's song, the one that I mentioned that you mentioned about a mother whose daughter has gone astray. I'm glad to hear the closure on that, and I will share also that I shared that song with a friend of mine who was having the same issue with their daughter. And it was beautiful and hard to listen to, I think, for them. And thanks be to God that their daughter has come around as well. So,
I sang it a while back now at John Piper's church, Bethlehem Baptist, and he introduced me by talking about that song. And his own son had gone, really astray, and I think he shared it from the pulpit. So I think I'm okay to say it here, but he said, well, while his son was really struggling and had fallen far away from God, Piper would stand on run on the treadmill and listen to that song over and over, and he said he would just cry and weep. So I was really moved to hear that.
Yeah, good. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, let me also encourage some people during the break to go to your website. It's FernandoOrtega.com. We'll come back and talk about a couple of other musical pieces, but also want to get into your photography. A lot of it taken from the Casa Ortega, and we'll talk about that and your sister and that whole area as well. And if you'd like to see the book, since we will be holding it up occasionally here in studio, you can actually go to the website and find not only the book, but also where you will be on tour and a number of news and updates, and then all of the music that is there. So the various CDs that are available, even the sheet music available, and much, much more. So you don't even have to know how to spell his name, although it should be pretty easy to spell. You just simply go to pointofview.net. You'll see his picture. Just scroll down there and visit the website. We'll come back and talk about some of the resources that are there, and also talk about God's creation. Whether it's music, whether it's photography, or whatever we can do to encourage those of you that have artistic ability. Sometimes we don't know what to do with some of those people inside the church, and we want to certainly highlight some of that today and encourage you to actually join with us. Perhaps you have a comment or a question about the influence of Fernando Ortega on your life. You can give us a call. That number is 800-351-1212. 800-351-1212. Steve Miller, Kerby Anderson, Fernando Ortega. We'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join that conversation, it's 1-800-351-1212. Steve Miller in studio with us as we're talking with Fernando Ortega. Let me just mention, too, that we always want to do what we can to encourage those of you in the arts, especially. And so this booklet I'm holding up right now is a book that we've made available in the past. It's Arts, Media, and Culture. I edited it with a number of different people contributing on the Christian and art, the Christian and film, the Christian and music, and a number of other things that I thought would be helpful because we do know that there is a real need for that. And before we're done, we might even get Fernando Ortega to talk a little bit about how we can encourage and what he might even say to some of these artists that are wanting to use their gifts and abilities in a way that can honor the Lord. And in case you are watching online, let me hold up the book. We're going to be talking about it in just a minute, but it is Fernando's Birds, and it is photographs and tales. And you'll learn a little bit more about some of these pictures, and just an incredible
They're
coffee
amazing.
table book, just unbelievable. But just before we get into talking about birds and God's creation, I think we have a couple more comments about music, don't we?
Yes, Fernando, you have collaborated with several people over the years, notable individuals, John Andrew Schreiner, others, and there's a lady that I'd like you to talk about, if you would, Elaine Rubenstein, a friend of yours that has co-written worked with you on your music, co-written, maybe written the lyrics. Talk a little bit about the experience you've had working with her, if you would.
Yeah, a very good friend that I talk to often. She and her husband Peter live in California, and when I moved from Pasadena, California, I was on Campus Crusade for Christ staff for 4 years, and I was based in Pasadena with the music industry. Then I moved to Irvine, California, and left Campus Crusade staff. And I wanted to learn how to write songs better, how to write lyrics better. So I enrolled in a poetry workshop that was taught by Elaine Rubenstein at Irvine Valley College. And this was a brutal class. I mean, you had to write a poem every week and then stand in front of the class and the next week and read your poem, and then it was open for criticism or critique. And they would just fire away. Oh, man. And some of the opinions were good, and some of them were just had to discard. But Elaine's opinions, her ideas, and the way she was able to find the best parts of what you had written and then help you throw away the worst parts, was something, and I was really glued to it. And so when I wrote my first album, which is called In a Welcome Field, which to me is unlistenable, but some people like it. My daughter plays it to torture me on the way to school sometimes. But
it's got Chimayo on it. How can it be bad?
That's right, and that's one of the better songs that came out of that time. But I took all these songs to Elaine, and we sat in this practice room, and I sang them for her. And she just didn't know I could sing, and so it really made our friendship deeper. And then later on, she didn't teach that class, but her husband took over the class, and I learned so much from both of them. And I still run my songs past them, and it's not uncommon for me to send a song that I think is fantastic to them, and then they'll write like, line 5 of verse 2 is the only good line in the song, So, no.
The wounds of a friend, though, right?
Yes, that's right.
Faithful are the wounds of a friend. That's right.
Yeah.
Whether you're a writer or a music writer, or whether you're a composer, whatever, you got to deal with that, right? That's part of it.
People like
and
that,
you're an
don't
actor,
you?
so you know what it's like to go in and do an audition and think you did well, and they say next.
and I've had brutal feedback, and I've one individual in particular, but I mean, brutal feedback, and then turn around months later, he saw me in something and said it was the best thing he'd ever seen me do. And what I learned then was don't ever take the critique of an individual is to too much to heart, perhaps, but especially if you have a good friend, at which he wasn't necessarily, but Elaine is, and I think that's vital for our
And
work.
isn't that interesting? You think of a person like Fernando Ortega. Of course, recently we were interviewing Michael W. Smith or a variety of others. Michael Card's been on the program with us, and you think they don't need anybody. They can do it all by themselves. And I'm picking up, Fernando, that mentors are still important to you even to this day.
Very important. And really losing Bill Harder, my pastor friend in Pennsylvania, was such. I think I was thinking about him this morning. Something came up, and I just thought, I wish I could call him and ask him, how do I handle this situation? And yeah, mentors are very important. And I loved Elaine's words as a poetry teacher and a songwriter. She just said, you polish something until it shimmers, and so that's just been my philosophy for writing songs. You just whittle away until the actual thing appears, and then it's finally a song. And those things, they end up sounding great, like you said. Was it with your acting? Is it you were talking about the best thing?
Yeah.
You work and work and work, and the thing is to present it as though it was effortless to get there, but in truth, it took a long time to get to that point.
It's the iceberg effect, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a fantastic analogy, and I think probably for what struck me when you came on the scene was that your music was complex. You were a classically trained pianist. You kind of defied the genres, and that appealed to me personally. But I think beyond appealing to me personally, it lets people know that you are very intentional about your work, and that the process is every bit as much as important as the product.
Yeah, and can I say something about that as well? This story comes to mind. When classical music was what I loved, and I looked at anything else, pop music and especially Christian pop music, as being such a step down from the height of music, which was playing classical concertos with an orchestra. So I went off to school to audition in the East Coast for different schools, Manhattan and Stony Brook and Eastman and all these places. I was rehearsing one time in the practice rooms at Juilliard. A friend of mine who was studying there let me in, and I was rehearsing for an audition the next day, and I was playing Chopin Ballade in A flat, number 3. And I could play it well. I was playing it, and then all of a sudden I heard the same piece coming from down the hall, and whoever was playing it was, oh my gosh, so much better than what I was doing. So I went down, opened my door and walked down the hall to peek in, and seated at the piano was this, I think she must have been 12 or 13, a little Asian girl. I think she was Korean, and the wind went out of my sails, and I blew my auditions. I know, and to me, that was as painful as that was to realize, wow, that little kid can play circles around me. I think it was God, gently but firmly pushing me away from that, me thinking that I was a world-class pianist, and showing me that my gifts were elsewhere.
Yeah.
And it took 2 years to rebound from that experience. And, then I started writing songs and playing, piano differently. And I'm so glad God did that, but it was a hard lesson.
Well, you rebounded very well, I would say. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it took years, though.
Just before we take a break, let me kind of set up what we will talk about after the break, and that is this book is just fascinating to me at a number of different levels. First of all, I got to love a guy that loves Canon cameras, because I've been back in the old days when we had single-lane reflexes. He's probably the only guy in the listening audience who knows what a Canon EOS R is, but that's what I've got, and he's got an R5, so he's really a little better off. But you are fortunate in the fact that you actually live in the Rio Grande flyover. So at first, when I was seeing all these pictures, saying, how did he do these? Especially when so many of them have a little statement, Casa Ortega. So I get the feeling that that's shot, right from your home. And then I began to realize that you really do have an opportunity to see so many of those birds. But then, of course, you've traveled to some other places as well. You got some pictures from Florida and Tennessee and a number of others. But when we come back from the break, I thought we might spend some time talking about this particular book that is full of beautiful photography. 150 pages worth, just incredible pictures, and also a tremendous amount of commentary. So if you've appreciated the words in music, you will appreciate the words next to these very stunning pictures of all these birds, and just a good illustration of the fact that we live in this incredible creation that God has given to us. There's a lot of darkness, there's a lot of concern, there's a lot of sorrow, there's a lot of mundane, but there's also a lot of beauty, and this book is full of beauty, isn't it? And
absolutely.
you're maybe not the bird watcher I am, but you hooked me on this book as soon as I got it. So, Fernando, when we come back from the break, let's, if we can, talk about how you took this love of birding and also added to that the photography. And it's a book that is available on your website, and you can go to fernandoortega.com to find out more about the book, as well as about the various music. And so we'll spend some time talking about that, but we need to take one of those mandatory breaks. We'll continue our conversation right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes talking with Fernando Ortega, and I thought we would talk about his book, Fernando's Birds, Photographs and Tales. And Fernando, I guess, first of all, we need to talk about the fact that so many of these pictures are taken from Casa Ortega, which when you were living in California, you were able to purchase that. And I would have to say that even though I love landscape photography and wildlife photography, I would say a handful of my pictures have been taken within a 50-mile radius of my home. But it's amazing to me, looking through this book, how many of these pictures were taken essentially in your backyard.
Yes, back and front yard. And this is actually my house in Albuquerque.
Yes.
Where these are taken. And so, yeah, when we bought this house years ago, I hired a landscape artist, and I told her she just designed the place. Me and my friend Gustavo installed all the walkways and plants and everything. But I told her we wanted to attract butterflies and birds and bees, and so she put all these plant names down, and we put them in. It took about 3 years to put them in, and after maybe 5 years, I thought, well, this doesn't look very impressive because New Mexico xeric plants grow very slowly. But now you look at the place, and it's so lush. And in the last 4.5, almost 5 years that I've been watching birds and photographing them, I've counted. I have about a little less than an acre of a yard. I've counted 115 species in my yard alone.
Wow.
Especially during that Rio Grande flyover that you were talking about.
Yeah, because you're right there in Albuquerque. Yeah.
Right along the banks of the Rio Grande, yeah.
That is just amazing. And again, these pictures are yours, but you also have family members that are part of that as well. Talk about how this all come together.
Well, mainly my sister Christina, who is listening right now as we are talking, and she has been photographing for a lot longer than I have.
Right.
She's a Nikon shooter, though, so someday she'll graduate up to the more advanced realm.
Yeah. I've always been a Canon shooter, so it's hard for me to imagine anything but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do. But so she was so fascinated by the birds and would sit there at the dinner table and tell us about birds. And I thought, okay, nerd alert. Boy, all of a sudden I had all these American Express points that I needed to use, and one of the things I bought was a Canon SL1, I think was the model, the number, and a small little lens that did magnify stuff a little bit, and I just got hooked from the first time I used it. And I think one of the first shots I took was of a ferruginous hawk. I don't know if you're familiar with that incredible white, beautiful hawk flying overhead. I just got his belly and his wings, but it was really in focus. And then I was hooked. Boy, it didn't matter what it was, a house finch or a goldfinch. I just loved photographing everything. And as you mentioned a little while ago, now I shoot with the Canon R5, I think, which is probably their flagship camera right now, but they're about to replace it with some other more incredible things.
Yeah, coming out.
R3, right. Yeah. Wow, you know your Canon stuff. And then the R1, I think, after that.
Yes.
But this camera is incredible, 45 megapixels, and it shoots 20 frames per second. And you can really capture some amazing birds.
Fernando, when I'll have to admit, when I first found out that you had written this book, I thought, a bird book? Why? How does that work? I'm thinking Fernando, the great musician, singer, pianist, and I thought, no, wait a minute, that makes perfect sense. This man who has always had an eye for the beauty of creation all around. And the tie in there suddenly, well, of course, how daft of me. You're surrounded by beauty there, from the mountains to the trees to the birds. And I think that's just a great testament to being open to all that is around us that speaks of God's beauty.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. I remember being backstage with John Scott. Not to drop a powerful name, but but I just did. But anyway, I was playing a fundraiser for his ministry, and we were talking, and that's all he talked about was birds. And this was long before I would ever find a love for birds. But I said to my manager, "Man, this guy's obsessed with birds." And I just wish now, he's gone now, been gone for a few years, and I wish that I could, show him some of my photos. I missed a golden opportunity, to talk to that man about how he, his theology of creation and of how God expresses himself in these incredibly intricate parts of nature. Like, when you stare at a hummingbird through a lens, and you see these tiny, tiny feathers and how the colors just work together, how they, either are sudden dramatic starkly to another different color, or how they, subtly meld into a different shade of the same color. But that how God expressed his mind to think of those things. Yeah. It's just staggering.
It's incredible artistry. Yeah. As we kind of near the end of the interview, which has gone by way too fast, but I would love it if you could speak to the artists out there. I don't know if they're photographers, singers, pianists, people who are perhaps have been at it for years, or perhaps who are just starting, and your advice to them, not to put you on the spot, would be what?
I think I go back to Elaine's words to me. I don't remember exactly when she said it, but that whatever your craft is, whatever your art is, if it's writing songs or writing poems or taking photos or painting things or whatever it is, polish it until it shimmers. The thing that you're working on, the song, polish it until it shimmers. Be brave to get rid of lines that don't help the thing. That are just superfluous or that are throwaway lines. Sometimes a throwaway line or a throwaway photo or a throwaway chapter is just there to get us to the thing that is important. And then just do what you do constantly, and for writers, I would say read writers that are better. Although I guess for anybody, surround yourself with people that are better than you.
Yeah,
sure.
At what you do.
And write every day. Write every day, and you'll be a better writer.
Day.
Yes.
Yeah, and then read every day as well, and you'll be.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah,
exactly.
So much. We're close on time, but let me again just mention Fernando's Birds, which is there. If you say, I'd like to watch a video, I just was, while we were talking about that, thinking about The Genius of Birds, which is Illustra Media. It's a great video. You can actually watch it probably on YouTube, and that will make you really appreciate God's creation as well. But most importantly, Fernando, we have your website, and if people want to connect up with you, if they want to know where you're going to be on tour, if they would like to get your book or like to get any of the music, it's all there at the website, isn't it?
It is, yes. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, too.
Well, again, it's FernandoOrtega.com, and if you're driving right now and don't have a chance to write it down, it's all at our website, pointofview.net. And Steve, I want to thank you for coming out from the other side of the glass to thanking us a little bit and helping us understand this whole discussion here today with Fernando Ortega.
Enjoyed it. And Fernando, thank you so much. I'm going to take your advice to heart as an actor, so appreciate what you said there, and the whole interview has been fantastic.
Well, thank you for being willing to be with us, and thank you for giving us an hour today. I know you're a busy person, but it meant a lot that you could join us today here on Point of View. Let me just, before we're out of time, I've already thanked Steve, but let's also thank Andrew. And then Ivy had to step in for you while you were here. And if you find yourself saying, this was good material, I'd like to listen to it again, you can certainly go to the website, pointofview.net, click on the button that says listen, or if you'd like to watch it, because we've been holding up the book and doing some of the conversation, you can find it pretty quickly here on the YouTube channel. So all of it is available at our website, pointofview.net. Tomorrow is our Friday weekend edition. Penedexter Kelly Shackelford, and we look forward to seeing you right back here on Point of View tomorrow, right here.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.